First, I also want to offer some thanks, first to Professor Rhone Fraser, also to Amy Williams-Gaudiosa, the Director of Campus Life, and the College Diversity Services Committee. Very thanks for the invitation to come and talk with you. I'm here to talk with you about something that is technically a crime. Many people would also think of it as an adventure, which you'll come to understand. And in the end, it's an act of resistance. And I don't know how familiar you are with acts of resistance. For instance, the Underground Railroad was a series of very important acts of resistance. And so was what I'm going to talk to you about today. In very short term, an act of resistance is when someone decides to violate a law in order to right a wrong, and that has taken many different forms. But I think that this act that I'm going to talk to you about today is one of the most powerful single acts of nonviolent resistance in American history. It's also a story of what happens when government keeps secrets and nobody asks questions of government, either the other parts of government like the Congress or the executive branch, or outside of government when journalists don't ask questions. Because if those people don't ask questions, then the public can't ask questions and can't force something to be done when the government itself is doing injustice. This is also a personal story for me, and I'll explain that later on. The specific action that took place was that on the night of March 8th, 1971, a group of 8 people whose names were unknown in the country and not very well known as individuals here, a group of 8 people burglarized the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole every file in the office and ran away with it in suitcases, and they went off to a farm up by Pottstown. That was the act of resistance that took place. Now, why in the world would somebody decide, a group of 8 people decide that they would burglarize an FBI office? It may have seemed like a particularly strange idea at that time, because it's hard to imagine this now. But in 1971, the head of the FBI was a man named J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover had been the director of the FBI since 1924, almost a half century by then that he had been director of the FBI. And he was much beloved by the American public thanks to an enormously successful PR operation that he ran from the office with taxpayer money. But there was another side that some people had suspicions about, but it was only suspicions. Nobody knew what was actually going on inside the FBI. But a man not too far from here, a man named Bill Davidon, who was a very mild-mannered person. He was a physics professor at Haverford College. And during the year 1971, which was a very depressing year in the anti-war movement, and he was an anti-war activist who was affiliated with numerous anti-war organizations. And that year, he kept hearing from many people that they feared that there were spies in their organizations, spies marching with them, spies in their offices, maybe even neighbors or people at work who were paying attention and reporting on them because of their political involvement, because of their involvement in civil rights, or because of their involvement in the anti-war movement. And he, being a scientist, really disliked conspiracy theories and disliked speculation. So at first he thought people were just so disappointed about the war continuing year after year that they're imagining that there are spies in their midst. But by late 1970, he became convinced, given the wide array of types of people who were saying this to him, that there really was a problem, that spies probably were infiltrating many organizations. And whereas other people would say, sure, they're doing it, but there's nothing we can do. The FBI is this huge, powerful institution. There's just nothing, you just have to live with it. And Bill Davidon rejected that, and he said, no, if dissent, one of the most precious values, rights of Americans, if dissent is being suppressed by the American government through the FBI, that is a terrible thing. And he finally came to the point where he thought that if that was the case, it was as important to stop the war on dissent as it was to stop the war in Vietnam. And then he thought about how unlikely it would be to use any of the usual channels that you use with a grievance. You know, going to your member of Congress, they hadn't paid any attention, they had never investigated the FBI or J. Edgar Hoover. Going to your president or your attorney general, President Nixon was very unlikely to be interested in finding out whether there was illegal surveillance going on. And so he decided, after giving this a great deal of thought, that the only way that you could find out, that you could get evidence, and that was key, that he believed that despite the fact that the American public believed that Hoover was the greatest official alive at that time, that if physical evidence was presented to them, documentary evidence was presented to them, that dissent was being suppressed, that Americans would be very upset and they would insist that something would be done. And so he met one by one with a group of individuals, and he asked them this question: what do you think of burglarizing an FBI office? A pretty strange question, don't you think? If somebody came to you and asked you that. Each of these people were people who had been involved in the anti-war movement themselves and felt deeply committed to opposing the war, but also truly valued dissent. And most of them had been involved in the civil rights movement, including going south and risking their lives at one time or another. So these 8 individuals, actually 9, one dropped out, 8 counting Bill Davidon, made a decision that they would case that little FBI office near the courthouse in Veterans Square in Media. And after months of casing, they would come to know enough information, they would decide whether they thought they could break in. They decided that they could, that they would take this risk. And again, keep in mind, they were risking decades of their lives in prison if they had been arrested. They had no idea whether there was anything of value in the office that would provide the evidence that they were looking for. So on the night of March 8th, they conducted the break-in. They chose that night because it was the night of the first Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight, World Championship heavyweight fight, which was an incredible night in the world, actually. The rights to broadcasting that fight had been sold throughout the world. And the reason they chose that night, they figured that everybody, including FBI agents, local police officers, would be absolutely engrossed. And that if they made any noises that night in the FBI office, they might not be heard by the people who lived above the office, and they might not be heard by anybody staying late at work in the offices below the FBI office. And so that's what they did. They conducted it while Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier were fighting each other at Madison Square Garden. A week and a half later, the fruit of the burglary started to become known. They had distributed the files to 3 journalists and 2 members of Congress. I was one of those journalists. I was a reporter at the Washington Post at the time. And despite very serious opposition to publishing them, the Washington Post did publish a story the next day after I received the files. And we can come back to why that was a difficult decision if you'd like to later on. And I'll just talk now about what those stories revealed from the files. The first one revealed a basic philosophy of the FBI. This was in writing, where agents were advised to make people paranoid, to make them think there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. That's actual language from one of the files, that they were instructed to behave in such a way that Americans would think there was an FBI agent behind every mailbox. A rather solid piece of evidence about what the goals were. But then there were also files about what was actually being done. For instance, on campuses in this area, a range of people were hired as informers by the FBI. For instance, switchboard operators were hired to listen to the phone conversations of professors that the FBI regarded as subversive simply because they were protesting the Vietnam War. Postal carriers were also engaged as informers and opened mail of professors. And middle-level administrators also were engaged as informers on those campuses against both students and professors. And another set of the files described in detail very extensive surveillance of African American communities in Philadelphia. And that described where African Americans could come under surveillance. And that meant literally anywhere a person went. The corner store, your library, your church, the bar down the street, the restaurant, or the bill collector at your door might be an informer. All of this was spelled out, where people could come under surveillance and where black people, the people who would come into black communities and be informers. And all of this, when the first stories were published, and there were many more sets of files that came out over the next couple months, was really a shock to people. There was an immediate outcry in Congress where for the first time, excuse me, some members, I think I need that water. Thank you. Sorry. For the first time, some members of the Senate called for an investigation of the FBI. And there were editorials for the first time that were written to call for an investigation of the FBI. And here in Philadelphia, especially, it was something that was a source of great conversation. So we had these burglars causing the American public to raise questions for the first time in this country about the role of national law enforcement and intelligence agencies in a democratic society. Until that time, there was the widespread belief in the public and among officials that intelligence agencies were off limits. This was the Cold War. And the feeling was we needed them to do whatever they thought was needed in order to protect the country. What we didn't know was that they had interpreted that, Hoover's FBI, and also the CIA, but especially Hoover's FBI, had interpreted that to give them leeway to go in directions that most Americans, when they learned about it, found unacceptable. Now, I'll give you some examples of other discoveries that were made. What happened was that about 2 years after the burglary, one of the files that had been in the media office played a very important role in major investigations and reform that would take place. One of the files had a big word at the top in block letters, COINTELPRO. We found out later that stood for Counterintelligence Program. The term had never been seen outside the Bureau until that one piece of paper, a mere routing slip that was attached to another file, became public. And when 2 years after that, in December 1973, another journalist had spent a year and a half trying to get the FBI to reveal what is COINTELPRO. He thought that that sounded like something that was very important, and especially because at the bottom of the memo it said that FBI agents should write anonymous letters to campus officials and provide the document that was attached to this on how to deal with campus demonstrators and professors who were against the war. And he thought that that was an extremely unusual thing, and he wondered what kind of a program was this. And so finally he sued. And a judge forced the FBI finally to open up COINTELPRO files. First, just files that explained what they were. And that the explanation was that these were secret operations that were designed to harass and distort the operations of organizations and also destroy the reputations of individuals. It didn't have anything to do with law enforcement, and this is very important because this is what also led the public to think this is not what a law enforcement or an intelligence operation is supposed to be doing. And I'll just briefly describe the range of kinds of operations that were revealed. I describe them as being from crude to cruel. Crude meaning, for instance, activist oranges were injected with laxatives. And another very crude, also cruel thing was to hire prostitutes. The FBI hired prostitutes who were known to have venereal disease and hired them to seduce activists. That sounds absolutely terrible, but it was far worse than that. One thing that the public by now is generally aware of is the horrendous pressure and dirty tricks that they did for years against Martin Luther King, including one terrible thing where they tried through letters and recordings that were sent to King and his wife, they tried to convince Martin Luther King to commit suicide. This was all done clandestinely. He didn't know the source of this information, and the public didn't know until after these investigations took place as a result of the burglary. Other things that happened, and all of this was disproportionately conducted against African American people. Another thing was providing an informer in Chicago to ingratiate himself with some of the Panthers, especially Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago, and find out where Fred Hampton slept. And he drew a diagram that said Fred's bed and gave that to the Chicago police, who gave it to a shooter who went in and in the night went in and shot Fred Hampton dead in his bed. Now, we're not talking about somebody who was under suspicion for crime. Another instance of someone in Los Angeles, Geronimo Pratt. Geronimo Pratt was falsely accused by an FBI informer, falsely accused and falsely testified against by an informer, with the FBI having full knowledge of this false testimony and coaching the informer in it, testified that Geronimo Pratt had committed a specific murder that he had been charged with. He had not. He was innocent. He served 27 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit because of this FBI operation to destroy him. Only in the 1990s, after 27 years, was he released as a result of getting a new hearing and the evidence coming out that FBI held exonerating information. And this also happened with some mob cases in Boston where people served 30-some years in prison, some of them on death row and some of them dying in prison, despite the fact that the FBI was involved in the false information being given and would not provide the exonerating information years later. Now, turned out that Bill Davidon was right. When the public learned about this information, people were very upset, and this brought pressure on Congress. And in 1975, Congress, both houses of Congress, held investigations of all intelligence agencies that had never happened before. And after the testimony, quite dramatic, including some of the things that I just told you about, the Congress then established permanent oversight committees that made it possible for Congress to, it required Congress, didn't always go along with this, but those committees were established to require Congress to do continuing investigation of intelligence agencies, continuing oversight of intelligence agencies. And one of the biggest things happened was that in 1974, the Freedom of Information Act was made stronger so that people could get files. And this then led to journalists and scholars getting files from the FBI, sometimes with great difficulty, but nevertheless, for the first time, they could get files. And that made it possible for historians and journalists to start writing the truthful history of the FBI instead of the public relations history that Hoover had written. Now, just briefly, before we have questions of my role in this, as I mentioned, I was a reporter at the Washington Post at the time, and I anonymously received the files from the burglars and wrote them. The publisher and the attorney for the newspaper thought that they should not be written about. It was quite a controversy because no journalist, as of this time, had ever received secret government files that had been stolen by someone outside government and given to a journalist. That, as opposed to a whistleblower inside government providing secret files. And actually, there hadn't been much of that either. So that was my first involvement with the media burglars. They were people unknown to me whose files I received and wrote about. My next involvement came many years later. They were never found. The Bureau assigned 200 agents. They were desperate to find the burglars. They never found them, and they never found a single piece of evidence or a witness. And this was true despite setting up a crime that was intended to entangle the burglars, but that failed. So many years later, I happened to be visiting Philadelphia. By that time, I had moved to California and I was teaching journalism. And I happened to be at the home of two acquaintances, John and Bonnie Raines, whom I had met in the late 60s when I was a reporter in Philadelphia. And in the course of my evening with them, their youngest of their 4 children came into the room. And John said, "Mary, we want you to meet Betty, because many years ago, when your dad and mother had information about the FBI that we wanted to give to the American public, we gave it to Betty." And I had no idea. He claims to this day that that was an accident, that he just blurted it out. I'm very grateful for the accident. But they told me that night that at the time, when they were done with their collating and ready to mail the files, that the 8 of them had made a vow to each other that they would take the secret of the burglary to their grave, assuming that they weren't arrested. And so about 2 weeks later, I got in touch with them. I've been talking too much lately. About 2 weeks later, I got in touch with them, and I said, "I know you've made this foul. you'll reconsider it, that I think this is a very important part of American history. And if you agree, I hope you'll help me find the other burglars. And they did, and that's how my book came about. And so, I'll turn it over.
Delaware County Community College, Behind Text, African Americans, A Concise History is the name of that book by Darlene Clark Hine. And she has a page in there where, she talks about the COINTELPRO, which you mentioned in your lecture, really was not a term that any of us knew about until when?
The public, I just want to really apologize for my, my voice.
Take your time.
I've been talking till late last night at Lehigh. The public didn't know about COINTELPRO until December 1973, when the FBI was forced, thanks to Carl Stern's lawsuit, that came about because of that media file. And at that point, we learned when and how it was established. And then people started applying for COINTELPRO. He had broken the ice. The FBI had been told by Hoover, FBI officials have been told, ignore Freedom of Information requests. And so no one had ever received files in response to a request until this lawsuit. And after that, other people applied. And that's when we started learning the specific dirty tricks.
Thank you. I read this, and I highly encourage everyone in this room and seeing this video that we're going to be recording. Thank you to Terence Lewis for taking record this video. This is about a 530-page book, and after reading it, one of the things that stuck out to me was, first of all, the climate that has been created since, because J. Edgar Hoover died the year after this was released. This was released, March, the burglary happened March 8, 1971. I think you write that he passed in May of 72.
Right.
By the time that he died, really, I was born in 79, so I'm not a baby compared to you. And so many people who were involved. But I grew up in a time where I would hear the heightened climate and what you talk about, the paranoia that FBI agents were paid to encourage, to just create a climate of fear that, like what you said in the first part of the lecture, the fear because of the idea that every FBI agent may be behind every mailbox. So that climate there. On page 350, you called Hoover the ringmaster of the anti-communist movement. But as I shared with you when we were walking through the STEM building here, the most salient point for me in reading the 530 plus pages of the book was Susan Smith's point that public resistance was missing because the resistors went into hiding. And you mentioned, when you heard me say that, you mentioned that they had to go into hiding. Can you explain?
Sure. And I think that she may be talking about other resistors in that context. You hear today people say that if Edward Snowden had any courage, he would have come out in this country and would be standing trial. And I'm sure that some people thought that back then about the media burglars. Their view at the time was that if they had become public, I mean, it's also true, of course, that they didn't want to go to prison, but they were willing to go to prison, and they had arranged their personal lives assuming that they would go to prison. The Raineses, John and Bonnie Raines, had 3 children at the time and made arrangements with a brother and with one set of their parents to raise their children in the event that they went to prison. So they knew that that was a possibility, but they wanted to try as hard as possible not to be found, because they thought that if they were arrested, that the focus of coverage, one, it would switch to them, that it would switch to people talking about who they were, their personalities. But more important than that, if they had been identified, the files would not have become public. The files, and the whole goal of their effort was to find information, and if it was important, if it showed that dissent was being suppressed, to make it public. So unlike a protest action such as those that had happened a few years earlier, like the trial at the Catonsville 9, where people had gone into a draft board symbolically and taken out just a few files and then burned them and stood around and waited to be arrested and then had a trial and went to prison. In this case, it was not symbolic. It was intended to actually have an impact by giving the public evidence that dissent was being suppressed. And if you didn't get the files into the hands of the public, it was worthless. And so therefore, if you stood and said, we've done this, arrest us, we're willing to stand trial, the action would have been wiped out. And again, just in the same way that in other kinds of resistance that you can imagine, such as the Underground Railroad, people didn't stand and say,
I was helped by this person, or
or that I'm doing this, either before or after, because it would destroy the act of resistance. It would defeat what you're trying to do. Yeah.
Thank you. You wrote that Hoover conveyed a sense of urgency, and I wrote my questions down because I'm like, wow, everything, let me just write it down so I don't forget it, because there's so much, but I had to narrow everything I read down into what are the 4 main points. And the second point I had is that you wrote that Hoover conveyed a sense of urgency about the need to monitor black students. You know, I was a black student, and I also teach black students. He said, quote, increased campus disorders involving black students pose a definite threat to the nation's stability and security. And black students indicate the need for increase in both quality and quantity of intelligence information on black student unions, end quote. And that really struck me, you know. There seemed to be increased focus by Hoover on black students. And what I was really thinking about is how that was a testament to how successful the sit-in movement was in 1960, where you had the North Carolina A&T students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sitting in that Woolworths, and that being copied across the East Coast. And then within 5 years later was the free speech movement. And certainly those students, one of them you mentioned, Mario Savio, in the free speech movement, was probably aware of what black students were doing in the sit-in movement. So that was obviously something J. Edgar Hoover did not like and was really trying to prevent a repetition of. But we also talked in the car about not only students but administrators. Could you talk about Clark Kerr and his relationship with J. Edgar Hoover?
Or his anti-relation.
His anti-relation, not a close relationship.
Yeah. You bring up, you touch on a number of important things. First of all, the civil rights movement was sort of the root of so many movements that came later, and certainly the anti-war movement and also the feminist movement. But Hoover, from the beginning, I mean 1924, from the time he first had power. Race was always very important to Hoover, a very strong anti-black attitude on his part that had enormous impact given how powerful he was. They placed the NAACP, for instance, under surveillance beginning in the 1920s, and that continued forever. So did the surveillance of the ACLU. One thing that happened, I think, that made him emphasize black students was the increase in the number of black students on campus, and he saw intellectuals in general, as you and I have discussed, intellectuals in general as suspect. Subversive was a very important word for Hoover, and it carried a very wide interpretation. It could be from a person who simply wrote a letter to their local newspaper expressing concern about the Vietnam War, all the way from that to someone who was a communist or someone who had been involved in a movement in a violent way. It's a very wide range of people who he put under that tent of subversive. But what happened to black students was very special, and the black community as a whole. But black students, for instance, in the media files, every black student at Swarthmore was under surveillance at that time. And also, there was an order that had been given just the previous November, I believe it was, that in the 60-some community colleges and colleges in the eastern Pennsylvania area where the FBI offices in the area were instructed to place informants on those campuses to monitor black students. So that if you were a black student, you were likely being surveilled by the FBI. It was a very strange and intense time. I should also add, every writer in the country, beginning in the late 1940s, also had a file and was monitored on a regular basis. Again, part of that anti-intellectual atmosphere. Now, you asked me about Clark Kerr. Clark Kerr was he was an economics professor at UC Berkeley, and he had first become the head of the Berkeley campus in the UC system, and then later in the late 1950s, I believe, the head of the entire system of the University of California. As an economist, he was liberal, and he also was a Quaker. And those things were anathema to J. Edgar Hoover. And he targeted him immediately. And he had him fired. He developed a plan with the then CIA director, not because he was a CIA director, but because he was a graduate of the University of California and knew people on the Board of Regents. And as soon as Ronald Reagan was elected governor, the CIA director worked with some of the regents, and Reagan and Hoover, and together they had Clark Kerr fired. I should also note that Clark Kerr at that time was regarded as one of the most respected people in higher education, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, and would continue through the Carnegie Foundation to have a role in education. But also, I should place the Clark Kerr incident in context. Hoover didn't just go after individuals or small groups or large groups of people, but also institutions. And what happened to Clark Kerr was a piece of a much larger plan that had started in the late 1940s against the entire University of California system, and that continued until the day Hoover died. He really disliked that entire system. It was the first very large system that provided an education at a very low price for a large number of people in the state. And again, those elements were anathema to him. And at one point in the late 1950s and 1960s, on the Berkeley campus, in a single year, he had informers and agents in the Bay Area do surveillance of every single faculty member on the Berkeley campus and write reports on them. And that included reports on their sex lives and reports on what magazines they subscribed to.
And this, just lets us know today, I think the reason I invited you is because I just see so much relevance to what you're describing in this book to today in terms of the information that is at the hand of our government and the inability of the Obama administration to question what Bush approved, which is the warrantless wiretapping of the national security agency. That inability to really challenge the NSA's power in reading our emails, not only sex lives, but what websites we go to, what calls we make, what text messages we send. I don't know if any of you have observed what's going on with the Facebook Messenger app. And when I learned about what that Messenger app is able to do on your phone, I had to get rid of it. So I don't care if every time I click on my messages icon in my Facebook app, it tells me, please install Messenger. I ain't installing it. That's just too much. No. In terms of what you just mentioned, Betty, in terms of, that level of surveillance, being able to have detailed information about your calls and your texts. I have two more questions, but I don't want to ask them. I want to take this opportunity to open it up to those that are here. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I will bring this mic to you, and you can ask our beloved guest today, Ms. Betty Medsger, about her book, The Burglary.
How you doing, Ms. Brown? My name is Tyler Jones. I'm a student at UCC. I want to thank you for coming out and sharing this information for us. It's very informative and enlightening. And my first question I have to pose to you is, why were you chosen from the major league? Why did they choose you?
Well, I didn't fully know the answer to that question until many years later when I found The Burglars. It's kind of an odd situation. Not why they chose me is not odd, but to anybody else, anybody who didn't know me at the time, it would have seemed odd, because the other two journalists who received the files were people who were quite famous at the time. Tom Wicker at the New York Times Washington Bureau, who was a columnist, and Jack Nelson, who was an investigative reporter based in the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times, and me. I was a reporter at the Washington Post who had just moved from Philadelphia a little more than a year earlier. They were both very high-profile people. Jack Nelson was probably the only reporter in the United States who had ever done any kind of investigative work on the FBI. And two stories, I think, and they really enraged Hoover. What I didn't know until fairly recently, actually, was that Hoover at that time was engaged in a campaign to have him fired from the LA Times. And what I found out when I read the 34,000-page investigation of the burglary by the FBI was that there was somebody inside the Times, obviously part of this campaign to fire Nelson. There was somebody in the front office of the Times who was intercepting his mail, and he never saw the files that were sent to him. They made a decision on their own to give them to the FBI that day. It's a little different at the New York Times, where Tom Wicker was a columnist, and he gave them to a reporter and said, you cover the beat, you look at this. And the reporter decided to give them to the FBI, I think out of more of a sense of patriotism than anything else. We had no idea at the Post that this was happening, that anybody else had the files. So we're making our decision completely like an island. But because I was relatively unknown at the time, by comparison to these two people, there was probably no one monitoring my mail. So my mail was unlikely to be intercepted. So I think that I owe the fact that I was able to receive them to that. So I like that. But the meek really do sometimes get something. But as for the burglars, they chose those two famous people because they knew that they both had written about the FBI. Wicker as a commentator and Jack Nelson as an investigative reporter. And they chose me, I think, because they were familiar with my work when I was at the Evening Bulletin in Philadelphia, and they had followed my work when I was at the Washington Post. And they believed that I was the kind of person who would recognize this as an important story and fight for it to be published. As it turned out, I didn't have to fight for it, but my editor, the editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, who died just a couple weeks ago, did have to fight for it very strenuously that day. And when I handed in my story at 6 o'clock, they were planning not to run it. And so he kept trying to convince, and succeeded by 10 o'clock to convince the publisher to publish the stories.
I'm glad you were chosen. I'm glad you were chosen.
So am I. And again, all those years later.
Anyone else? Anyone else have a question? Yes, Denise, one of my students.
My question is, did you know the burglars before they gave you the FBI file? Because I remember you said, like, you know, you went to their house and then they said, I'd like you to be Betty because she did what she did with the files that we gave her. So I just want to know, did you know them before you had the files, or like did you meet them after? Without knowing?
You want to know, when did I come to know the burglars? Okay, there were 8. I didn't know all of them. I knew 2 of them, the couple, John and Bonnie Raines. When I worked in Philadelphia, I covered religion much of the time. And John Raines was, and still is today, a professor at Temple in the religion department. And that department was doing some innovative teaching. And I wrote about him a few times in that connection, and also briefly met Bonnie. And so we were acquaintances. We were not close friends. We were acquaintances. But I just want to make it clear, at the time that they sent me the files, I didn't know who was sending them to me, and I never had any idea. And so it was many years later that when I came back to Philadelphia to visit, that weekend I just scheduled my entire weekend with old acquaintances, people I wanted to see, and that's how we connected. A nice piece of luck.
Hi, I have a question. You mentioned a couple times the public reaction to the revelations, and I wonder if you see any similarities or differences to the public reaction to the NSA revelations that you're thinking about from that experience.
Well, I'm an observer just as all of you are on that, but because of the connections I see, I do pay attention to it. At first, people were really kind of angry. I think the majority of the public was, instead of paying attention to the content of what Snowden was releasing, I think they were paying more attention, again, because of the fact that he became known. But then I think that changed as more files came out, and and reading, for instance, about a plan that's well underway to be able to tap any phone, any cell phone, anytime, any place. I think that attention was focused on the substance. The same thing happened in Congress to some extent. By last fall, there was a bipartisan approach and wanting to bring the NSA under control in regard to some of these programs. And that's gone back and forth, and I now feel as though there's a lack of interest as more information comes out. I think that the fact that people have not seen an emphasis on the files that reveal that individuals can be surveilled on has made a difference. What we were learning back then was about the FBI's coming down on individuals, secretly developing files and dirty tricks and murder. And that really moved people. And I think when you talk about metadata, it's harder for people to react. It doesn't get people in the gut as much. But I also think it has something to do with the nature of leadership, that J. Edgar Hoover was such an iconic figure in the American public's mind. And then when our attitudes changed, he was still this person that we felt that we had a misimpression of, and he really was this rather than that, but we related to it. And now I think that the people in charge have a different role in the public's life. They're more like faceless bureaucrats than they are people that we think speak to us about how they're doing this for our benefit. I think there is a great, and it certainly also must have something to do with the fact that it's a very different kind of time in society, where we were a divided society then, we're a divided society now. But it seems to me, and there are other people who could react to this, that we were a much more passionate society then, that people really cared and felt they wanted to confront issues more than they do now.
Yeah, I think technology plays a big role in that, in terms of, being able to mobilize. There's nothing like marches. I see Amy here. Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for helping organize this. And Betty was asking me on the way here, Amy, if we officially have to stop at 12:15 or if we could take a little longer.
We can take a little longer. The matinee starts at 2 o'clock, so we will...
Okay, about 12:30?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we have until that time here, but if you guys have to go, I wanted to say you can go by. I just wanted to thank you so much, Amy, for that clarification. I just wanted to make that clear, so we'll go until that time. I did have two more questions that I had prepared. When I was reading your book, Betty, I was routinely thinking about the relative privilege that the burglars had compared to, those in the Black Panther Party. You mentioned in your lecture Geronimo Pratt, and I'm also thinking about Eddie Conway. I was just in a meeting in West Philadelphia where an activist there handed me his book. He was a Black Panther Party member in Baltimore. I was also thinking about Manning Marable, and he wrote a biography of Malcolm X, and how he writes at the end of it that he was denied files in his Freedom of Information Act request, his FOIA request for files about Malcolm X. This was not the experience that Bill Davidon had, who got 34,000 pages, as you write on page 445. And you also write that he got a formal apology from an FBI official in the delay that they had in giving him the papers. I just thought that, I think one of the reasons you talk about us being a divided country, the different experiences Marable had with the FOIA request to Davidon's experience being different. That's a good example of how divided we are. We treat, black men a certain way, and then we treat white men a certain way. And then, Malcolm X's death is still unprosecuted. His murderer, whom Marable names in his biography, is still out there at large, okay? And his grandson died in Mexico under very mysterious circumstances that people say doesn't make sense when you read about it in the New York Times. Because the New York Times reported that 2 waiters killed him in Mexico City, but the last I checked, over an unpaid bill, you know. I don't think waiters do that on a regular basis in Mexico City. So it's just a lot of mystery, but my point is that we have these unprosecuted murders of unarmed black men. Malcolm X, Malcolm Shabazz, Trayvon Martin this year, Eric Garner this year, and Michael Brown. Can you speak to this and maybe what your book maybe can get us on the path of maybe getting these murders prosecuted?
Well, I don't know whether I can speak to how we can get those murders prosecuted. I seem to learn about a new one of an unknown young black man every couple weeks. Let me sort through some of the issues. First of all, let me make it clear, the burglars. The burglars had no privilege. Except to the fact in daily life, as unknown as burglars, they enjoyed the same kind of white privilege that other white people have. But as the media burglars, they were hated. And his plan was to have them charged with espionage, which if that had happened, if they had been arrested during his lifetime, he would have pressed for that. And if that had happened and they had been convicted, they would have served decades in prison, and that's what they had anticipated. And that treatment continued after his death. But it's also important to understand that the hatred of this crime and the determination to get the people who had caused his secrets to start tumbling out was so intense that the FBI set up a crime in which 28 people were arrested in Camden. And the FBI knew at the time that those people did not want to commit that crime and had tried to call it off, and only because their informer on their orders provided the equipment and kept pushing for it to happen, did it happen. And that was because the FBI thought that those people were the media burglars, and that by arresting them, they would get the media burglars. So I tell that story just to illustrate how extreme they didn't have privilege. But I understand what you're talking about in another context. And also, it's important to understand that when Bill Davidon, years later, applied under the Freedom of Information Act for his file, and then later for the file on the burglary, they didn't know that he had anything to do with media. So it wasn't as though he was someone that they perceived as involved in a crime, now asking for the file on that crime. So, but in terms of your bringing it to the future, and the more important thing is the working on public perception and taking each one of these cases and making sure that people know what is happening to black people, especially black men in this country today. And I think that also speaks to the need for to look at law enforcement training, what is happening that makes it possible for such extreme results to be. We need to, as a society, to recognize that.
Anybody have any other questions? All right, my last question. We talked about the Obama administration, and Ellie asked about they're approving, sanctioning the NSA wiretapping, and then you mentioned also whistleblowers as people within the government or the corporations that they are critiquing by release whistleblowers. The media case was the first time where people outside a corporation or government was releasing information about the government to the public. And I think that is relevant to today when we think about whistleblowers and their importance. Chelsea Manning, and most recently, Rolling Stone had an article by Matt Taibbi about Elaine Fleischman and her whistleblowing against J.P. Morgan Chase. Part of me wants these crimes by whistleblowers to be brought to light and the issues that they're raising to be addressed, solved, because what Elaine Fleischman was doing was raising the fact that J.P. Morgan was selling bad loans that have been defaulted and making still so much money from them, even though they're built on predatory lending practices against communities of color. I'm just brainstorming now as one who wholeheartedly supports the work of whistleblowers about what might be different ways that the media burglars could have shared the information other than giving it to reporters. That's my basic question. Because you're a reporter, I know you would like to get information that you got about, details that the government is trying to hide from the public. But my question is, do you think, is there any other ways you think, besides giving to reporters, that somebody who wants to expose a malfeasance can expose the malfeasance, besides maybe giving it to a reporter to increase public awareness?
Well, it's an interesting question. Bill Davidon, I like to say that if the internet, if Bill Davidon had not succeeded in, when they distributed the files, in getting anyone to publish the information, that he would have invented the internet in 1971. And by that, I simply mean that his determination was so great that he would have found a way, and there sort of was a plan B, and that there was an organization in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Resist. And after a few weeks of distributing the files, he made sure that Resist received all of the files, and then they distributed them to people who wanted them. But by that time, he already had distributed quite extensively to journalists and to students who were named in them, and other people who were named in the files. At that time, I think I need this water again. The interest was in getting the information to the largest number of people, and that certainly meant that you would get it to a journalist and hope that somebody would publish it. It's interesting to hear Edward Snowden talk about his decisions. It really speaks to your question. Edward Snowden is a very savvy person technologically, as we all know. So Edward Snowden could have set up a website and could have distributed this material himself on a website. He chose not to do that, and it's interesting to hear him describe it, and it's a different approach than WikiLeaks or Chelsea Manning. He said that although he spent a lot of time deciding what to release and intended not to endanger national security, contrary to what was said about him by the government at the time, his desire was not to endanger national security and to release only files that he thought the public needed to know because of things being done against the public that were not helping make us safer, but that were intruding into our privacy. He thought that he didn't have the expertise, sufficient expertise, to make those judgments, even though he had tried to make them. And so he decided that he needed to find journalists who had expertise, ability in making that judgment about the files. And so the two people that he sought out, Laura Portress and Glenn Greenwald, were such people. And then they also brought in, with his knowledge, a reporter at the Washington Post, Bart Gellman, and reporters at the New York Times, Jane Risen among them. And Snowden explains that he thought that that was extremely important because they had the ability to put more filters and to refuse to publish things that may actually have the power to endanger national security. And I realize that people have a hard time believing that because of what was said about him originally before we heard him speak. But that really was the reason he thought it was important. That's in contrast to some of what WikiLeaks did, which was to take some of Chelsea Manning's records and just dump them.
5 newspapers.
Well, dump them on the internet. Dump them on the internet. I mean, they also did, but dump them on the internet. And in fact, probably some of them did endanger individuals. So Snowden is sort of endorsing exactly what the burglars did then, that it's important to find journalists who are going to have a sense of responsibility for it. Of course, then the conversation that takes place afterwards is much different now than then because of technology.
Any other, oh yes, Julia.
I want to follow on Bill Abaddon was among the burglars.
If Bill
I'm sorry.
Abaddon was among the burglars?
Yes. Was he among the burglars?
He was the leader of the burglars. He was the person who conceived the idea. He was the person who then went to the others one by one and asked them what they thought of the idea. And then together they decided to do it. And then he continued to be the person who had conceived how to distribute afterwards. Yeah, definitely. There was a 9th burglar who dropped out right before the burglary.
And you told us that you have a paperback copy of this book. This is the hardback, but there's a paperback that you told Ellie includes what in it?
As I mentioned, there were 8 burglars. 7 of them were found while I was doing my research. The burglars helped me find, and I found 7 of the 8. And 5 of the 7, or 7 of them told their stories. 2 used false names because for different personal reasons. They didn't want to be identified, but their stories are in the book. But then there was that 8th burglar that we were never able to find. Neither the burglars nor I could find her. And then she surfaced this spring after the book came out. And her story is told in the epilogue to the paperback of my book, which was just published. And her story is very different. The rest of them all stayed here in Philadelphia and lived in plain sight. They went about their daily lives, just their jobs, their families, everything just as they had before. Taxi cab driver, religion professor, physicist, daycare center operator, everything that they had been. This person decided, this is too dangerous. I'm getting out of here. I'm going west of the Rockies. I'm going underground under an assumed name. She was 19 then, she's 63 now, and she's just become public after all these years.
Thank you so much, Betty Medsger, for your time in talking about the burglary. And let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you, and thank you very much.
Special thanks again to so many people that helped make this possible. George Dobbins, Terence Lewis, Amy Williams-Gaudioso, Jerome Parker for greeting Betty Medsger, and thank you for students for coming out and supporting this event. This is part of the College Diversity Programming Series. Be sure to support future events, part of this series in the future.